fantastic. Well, if you noticed the title of today's sermon, you probably wondered if I've been watching too many war movies or if I've been drinking too much coffee. I want to assure you that it is neither of the two. I have not been watching war movies, and in my world there is no such thing as too much coffee. Now, you've heard this term used before. You've heard Gung Ho. And most of us think of it as a person who is almost annoyingly enthusiastic about whatever particular cause or endeavor that he or she is engaged in. We already know that this term is associated with the military, but it also applies in many other avenues of life. There are Gung Ho police officers, there are Gung Ho firefighters, there are Gung Ho teachers, there are Gung Ho salesmen from Empire Carpet. I know this because we had one come to our house one time. There are also Gung Ho airline pilots, Gung Ho surgeons, and Gung Ho pastry chefs. Vocational enthusiasm knows no bounds. Well, today, I'm going to destroy that perception of Gung Ho that probably you have had. I'm going to expose it for the myth that it really is. The word or words Gung Ho do not actually mean unbridled enthusiasm for an endeavor. They don't. It doesn't mean that at all. So if at your workplace you have one of those Energizer bunnies that thinks that everyone else should be just as happy for Monday morning as he or she is, you will have to come up with another adjective, and I'm sure you can, to describe them other than Gung Ho, because Gung Ho is not it. What it actually means, Gung Ho, first of all, is an English term. It is an English term that finds its roots in another word of similar sound in Mandarin Chinese that actually means working together. That's what Gung Ho means. It is a term that implies things like teamwork and community, but the words Gung Ho have nothing to do whatsoever with energy and enthusiasm. There, now that I've shot that down and it's crashed and burned, you know what the term Gung Ho actually means. It means working together. On that note, that is kind of what the Apostle Paul is getting to in his letter to the Corinthians, and we find him addressing this very thing this morning. It is an insert. You should have this insert in your bulletin. It's too wordy to put on the overhead, but I'm going to ask you to refer to it in just a moment. We're going to walk through this verse by verse. You already know that the church in Corinth was a dysfunctional church. We mentioned that a couple of weeks ago. They yelled at each other during worship. They got drunk during communion. I mean, they were nuts. Well, another issue that held the Corinthians back from reaching their full potential is that too many of them got all hung up on church leadership. To them, it was all about the guy in charge, and everything rose and fell with that particular person. And at the center of this storm was Paul himself. But in addition, there was another leader named Apollos who also held some influence. Let's pick up here in verse 3. Paul writes this, "For you are still of the flesh, for as long as there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not of the flesh and behaving according to human inclinations?" When Paul says that they are of the flesh, he is saying that they are living and behaving and thinking and speaking in complete opposition to the Spirit. To be in the Spirit means to be in-tuned to God. So therefore, anything that is in opposition to that is of the flesh. They're not tuned into God, and he calls them out for yelling at each other. Verse 4, "For when one says, 'I belong to Paul,' and another, 'I belong to Apollos,' are you not merely human? In other words, they had their favorite pastors. Verse 5. What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you came to believe, as the Lord assigned to each. Pastors and other church leaders are merely servants. They cannot take the place of God in a person's life. Verse 6, this is an important one to remember. In fact, this would look great on a bumper sticker. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. Think about that one. We do things in the church, so many of us do different things, but we don't make the sun rise, and we don't cause the sun to set, and we don't cause the blowing of the wind. God's unseen hand is at work here at St. Paul, even though we can't actually see it. And then the last verses 7, 8, and 9. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. The one who plants and the one who waters have a common purpose, and each will receive wages according to the labor of each. For we are God's servants working together. You are God's field, God's building. And speaking of bumper stickers, just let me give you the real short bumper sticker version of what Paul is saying here. Paul is saying that the true church will be a Gung Ho church, a church in which everyone in it work together. You see, the church, it's not its pastor. The church is not its moderator, council president, chief elder. The church is not its board, its committee, or one particular family. The church is every person in it working together. Every person in it who sees themselves as a man or woman of a particular time and place, a man or woman of God, in that time and place, doing what God has uniquely wired them to do and called them to do. Throughout my years in the ministry in different churches that I've pastored, I occasionally have had someone say to me, "You're it. You know, you're the main guy. You're the big boss." It makes me a little nervous when I hear that, but I knew that they meant it in goodwill when they said it, and so I took it in goodwill, but it still made me a little bit nervous. And I said, "No, actually I'm not. The main guy, the big boss, that's not me. I didn't die on a cross and rise from the dead." In the United Church of Christ, our denomination, as with all other Protestant denominations, I can't speak for the Catholic Church because I've never been a Catholic, but in Protestantism particularly, we believe that the one sole head of the church is Jesus Christ. He is the head guy, if you prefer to use that term. I prefer to call him Lord. You and I, actually, we just work for him. We sit at different desks. We have maybe a little bit different departments, but we all work for him. We are all co-equals before God. We're each given different gifts for service, and we each have different things that we do, but we're all equal. You know, putting on this black robe doesn't make me any more holy than it does anyone else. In fact, in Romans 13, Paul says, "I put on Christ," and we are each one to put on Christ. Knowing this, it is very important for the church to stick together, for us as St. Paul to stick together, and for the whole church to stick together, to not get all hung up on who's in charge, and instead to be focused on following Christ and being God's people in the world. Just like it says here, some of us plant, others of us water, but who gives the growth? God gives the growth. God is the one who ultimately does it. There was a sailor and a landlubber who went fishing together one day. they went out in a rowboat, and they had their fishing poles, and I think they had a net, and they were out there and fishing away, and pretty soon the landlubber caught a big fish. And this fish was so big, and he held on to the poles as tightly as he could, that this fish actually began pulling the boat a little bit. And finally, in a last-ditch effort to get away, the big fish made a huge surge and pulled the landlubber right out of the boat and into the water. And being the landlubber that he was, he couldn't swim a stroke. And he called out to the sailor, "Help, save me, I'm drowning." And the sailor, wanting to pull him back into the boat and to save his life, reached over, and the only thing he could get a hold of was the man's hair. And he pulled him by the hair, and it came off, and it turned out he'd been wearing a wig, and boom, down he went. So almost instantly, the sailor quickly decided to grab the man by the arm, and he did so to begin pulling him back in. The arm came off. He had an artificial arm, and down he went again. The sailor was a quick thinker, so he reached down, and this time he grabbed a hold of a leg. Guess what happened? Linda's shaking her head at me like, "Boy, you ought to be ashamed of yourself." That's right, it was an artificial leg. It came right off, and down he went. And he came up for the last time with his head above water, and he said, "Help, save me, I'm drowning." And the sailor said to him, "Well, I would if he would just stick together." I know some of you, I'm going to see my email inbox fill up tomorrow for that. I don't care. It was so worth it. The church needs to stick together. May the church stick together and not come to pieces. Some plant, some water, but God gives the growth. Amen.